I'm Sarai.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio.
Welcome back to Seamwork Radio. Today we're talking about some of the best sewing shortcuts to help you save time off sewing. And we're going to cover tips that we use to shave time off sewing, and then where we like to take shortcuts and where we don't like to take shortcuts. And we're also going to share several tips from the Seamwork staff and community that we love. All right. So our icebreaker today comes from Seamwork member Stasia. And Stasia asks, did you ever have a garment fall off or fail to stay fastened? This is a fun one. How about you, Haley? Ever have that happen? I know you have.
Yes. Yeah. Sarai knows this story. This wasn't really the fault of the garment necessarily, more my own personal fault. I was living in LA and my best friend Rachel took me out to this like really fancy restaurant in Hollywood for my birthday. And so we got all like dressed up, and I had just made this really fitted skirt for myself, which did have a vent in the back, you know, for walking. And being like a total goofball like I am, we're in the restroom while we're waiting for our table to get ready. And I decide to show Rachel, you know, like the butterfly, the dance. And so I'm like straight up twerking in this restroom. I totally split my skirt from the vent straight up to the butt. I turned the vent, the, you know, modest vent, into a very daring rated R vent. And I was horrified. Oh my gosh. Even more horrified because I did this to myself. It was my fault that my skirt is about to fall off my body. We were just cracking up. I look at Rachel. I'm like, what am I going to do? She's like, girl, we're in Hollywood. Do you think that you're the most scandalously dressed person here? And I was like, yeah, you're right. And so I just walked around the rest of the night like, this is how I want this to look. I want my butt cheeks to show. I just owned it. So that's my story about my wardrobe malfunction. It's really more of like my thighs, you know, just ruining a garment.
They couldn't be contained, Haley.
Could not be contained. This butterfly cannot be contained.
Oh.
What about you?
Oh man, I've had so many wardrobe malfunctions over the years. Like for some reason, there's one that comes to mind that was when I was living in New York. I don't know why this one comes to mind because I'm sure this has happened many times to me, but I was wearing sort of a full skirt. It was a wrap skirt. Yeah, you can see where this is going. So I'm like walking down the street and I remember just like stepping off the curb into the sidewalk and this huge gust of wind came and just completely blew my skirt open, like over my head open. And it's New York, so there are people everywhere. So it's not like I could just pretend like nobody saw this. This was a very public display of my underwear. And so I just like pushed it down in a frantic, you know, panic. And then, you know, when that happens, you just have to like walk with your hands like clenched to your thighs the rest of the way home to keep it from happening again. And you just, I don't know, it's so stressful. And must be a stress response that has made that sear into my brain. Whenever I wear a wrap, like a full wrap skirt like that now, I will always, if it doesn't have some kind of like a fastener on the bottom, I'll just like safety pin it because that was embarrassing.
Yeah. Fool me once, shame on you.
Yeah.
You hear that wind? I also am now having a memory, Sarai, of you getting stuck in a dress at work. Oh, you were trying on like some kind of sample or something, and the zipper got stuck, and I like had to cut you out of it.
Oh my God, that's happened so many times. I've gotten stuck in dresses so many times. It's so awful when you're in a dressing room trying something on and I remember that happening once in a vintage store and the dress was literally stuck on my shoulders. I have pretty wide shoulders. It was stuck on my shoulder, like I was trying to pull it over my head and it was just stuck there with my arms above my head. And I was terrified. I couldn't get out of it. Like, what do you do?
Yeah.
What do you do?
Oh my gosh, I'm so claustrophobic. I hate when that happens. I freak out. Totally freak out.
I guess
a good icebreaker.
Yeah, I guess I managed to wriggle out of it eventually because I'm here. So
You're here.
I didn't spend the rest of my life in that dressing room. Thank you for this icebreaker, Stasia. This was a really fun one. If you have an idea for an icebreaker, especially a funny one like this, I loved this one, you can submit it to us just by going to seamwork.com/go/icebreakers if you're a Seamwork member, and it'll take you right to the post on the community where everyone can share the icebreakers they would like to submit, and we choose from them when we put together the episode. So thank you again, Stasia. I love that one so much. So onto our topic today, which is shortcuts for your sewing, which is a really fun topic. I personally don't like to rush through my sewing too much, but I do feel like shortcuts in certain areas help me to save time so that I can spend more time on the parts that I really enjoy about sewing. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about that a little bit first. And Haley, what are your least favorite parts of sewing, first of all?
Well, I think I talk about this all the time, but I just do not really enjoy cutting. And something related to that I also don't enjoy doing is trimming and grading seams. I do it because you have to. You have to do it. But I think it really stresses me out because I'm always freaked out that I'm going to cut a hole in my garment, which I have done before.
I think we've all done that.
That is not a step that I enjoy. What about you?
Yeah, I really, kind of similar but different. I think we'll cover this in one of our tips, but I really hate getting to the end of a project and having to cut off all the little threads. I just find that so annoying, and I always miss a whole bunch of them. And then you find them when you wear it for the first time, and I don't know, it just kind of, I feel like I should be done by this point, and I still have to like fiddle around with these little threads, and for some reason that just is not fun for me. That's a little thing.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of cutting either. You can make it fun. Like I put on music and try to kind of batch my cutting together, and I try not to do my cutting and my sewing on the same day a lot of the time so that I'm not trying to rush through the cutting to get to the sewing. But I do kind of feel that way about cutting as well. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I really dislike. I think those are the areas that I think really stand out to me. What are the parts that you don't like to rush through? Are there parts that you like to take your time with?
Yes. I think you and I might have the same answer to this. Pressing.
Mm-hmm.
I love pressing. I think that it's the most like zen part of sewing. Another thing I don't like to rush through is darts, because I think that a bad dart can ruin a project. So I really take my time and try and make them really lovely.
Yeah. I feel that way about like finishes and zippers and things like that. Like just taking my time to make sure that they really look nice, because I think it makes a big difference in not just how the garment looks, but just how I feel about it. If I feel like I took my time to make it really look good, I think that's an area that I don't like to rush through. So I feel like the important thing is more how you feel about the garment than how much time it took you. So I think when we talk about these shortcuts, it's like just evaluating, will taking a shortcut here make me feel any differently about this garment, or will it just speed up a part of the process that needs speeding up? I think it's a nice kind of way to approach it.
Well, that leads us into our tips. We have kind of two sections of tips today. I'm going to share Sarai and mine's favorite tips, and then Sarai's going to share some member tips and some team tips. So kicking us off, make a muslin. It doesn't seem like a time-saving tip, but it is, because you're going to spend probably more time trying to salvage bad fit than if you would have just made a muslin to begin with. I think that this kind of feels counterintuitive, but it's very, very true. Another tip is use a rotary cutter. If you're like me and Sari and don't love cutting, using a rotary cutter, making that investment in the rotary cutter, the mat, all of that is going to cut down your cutting time probably in half. It is that big of a time saver. So definitely check that out.
I always use a rotary cutter, always.
Yeah, it's a game changer. When I started doing it, it was a major game changer. Tip 3 is to properly prep your project. Make sure that you're transferring all of your markings, cut and apply your interfacing and stay stitch. Do all of that at the very beginning. Something that I see a lot of people do is they don't transfer their markings, or they wait to cut and apply their interfacing, or don't stay stitch, or wait to stay stitch. And all of these things, in the case of the cutting, your interfacing and the marking, you're having to break your flow to then go back and do things you should have done at the beginning. And that just really slows you down. In terms of stay stitching, if your neckline stretches out or whatever edge you were meant to be stay stitching, then you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to counteract that stretching and that growing that happened. So do all of your prep up front. It really does make a big difference. If you don't already, using a screw punch to help you mark more quickly is a really great time-saving tip. A screw punch is like a mini kind of hole punch. You use it to punch holes in your patterns, and then you can really quickly transfer those circle markings with chalk over onto your pattern, and it is a great time-saving tip. Press and snip threads as you go. This is related to Sari's least favorite sewing step. Snipping your threads as you go is going to save you a lot of time at the end, as well as pressing. This is going to save you time, and it's also going to make your projects look so much more professional, and you're a lot less likely to make mistakes and get little weird puckers in your seams if you're properly pressing your fabric.
Yeah, what I like to do with the threads is just sew a few stitches and then snip off the beginning thread tails and then finish stitching to the end. Because that way you remember to do it. I think if I wait until after I've stitched the whole thing, there's a temptation to just move on to the next seam.
Totally.
Then you have to search out where the beginning of the seam was and cut the threads. But if you just stitch a few stitches, snip, and then keep going, you don't have to find those thread tails again.
What I like to do as a reminder for snipping my thread tails is I keep my thread nips on my ironing board, and I keep my little wastebasket underneath the ironing board. So when I go to press a seam, I can trim off anything. And I also do any trimming or grading or clipping that needs to happen.
That's smart.
That leads us right into our next tip, which is a great one. Lower your ironing board down so it's at the same level as your table. This is especially great if, like me, you sew on a chair that has a swivel to it, because then you can just spin around and press. Just be careful not to get dizzy, I guess.
Don't spin too many times.
Yeah, just, I'm talking like a 90 degree, not like a 360 situation.
Safety first.
Yeah, especially with a hot iron nearby. I don't know. You do you. Our next one is a fun one. Use an old wine bottle with a pour spout to refill your iron quickly, so you don't have to like go to the sink every time. I also stress my husband out when I bring my iron over to the sink to refill it. He thinks I'm going to like electrocute myself or something, I think.
Even though it's unplugged?
I don't know. He doesn't iron much, so. I love ironing. So I'm always like, I'll press that shirt for you. Not because we have any strict gender roles in our house. Because I'm weird and I like ironing. Our next tip, this is my favorite time-saving practice, not necessarily a tip, is to learn how to batch sew whenever possible. So for instance, if you are reading your sewing instructions and the next 2 steps are to sew and finish the underarm seam on the sleeve and also the side seams, go ahead and pin all 4 of those seams, stitch all 4 of those seams, finish and press them all at the same time. You're going to save a lot of time incorporating practices like this into your sewing. And this kind of goes along with another tip we have, which is to make sure that you're skimming through your instructions beforehand, because you're going to be able to identify those batch sewing moments a lot more easily if you read your instructions in advance and also have a general understanding of how something is going to come together before you start sewing it.
Yeah, I always like to think about how far I can get with my stitching before I have to press. And then that helps me to like think about how I can batch things together. And you'll know that you can batch things together if, for example, the seams don't intersect. And so if they do intersect, then you might have to press one seam before you stitch over it, because you don't want to stitch over a seam that hasn't been pressed, because you might get some bubbling there. So you just think about like, how many seams can I do without pressing before I head over to the iron?
That's a great way to think about it. Our next tip is to mark fold lines with machine basting instead of chalk. This is specifically for your hem. So if you're doing a double fold hem and you're folding up at 1/4 inch and then folding up at 3/8, go ahead and put a basting stitch in at 1/4, another basting stitch 3/8 away from that 1/4 inch. And it's actually a lot faster than using a chalk. And the needle kind of perforates the fabric in a way and makes it a lot easier to press under. This is a really great tip, especially on curved hems. I find it to be really helpful because those can be a little pesky to mark.
Yeah, I think on curved hems or any fabric that's a little bit more flowy and difficult to press neatly, like a silk or, like a drapey rayon or something like that, it just kind of creates that line for you. It's almost something that you can press over, you know what I mean? Like the thread that's in the basting stitches almost allows you something to press over and stabilizes it a little bit. So it just makes it so much easier.
Totally. Our next tip is to try chain sewing. This is a little quilter's tip. I know a lot of quilters do this. By chain sewing, what we mean is that you can do this on your domestic machine with a straight stitch. You can do it with a serge, or even it's when you're piecing things together. So for instance, if I am sewing side seams, I need to sew the side seam on my bodice, and then I need to sew the side seam on my skirt. I can pass the bodice through my sewing machine, sew a couple stitches, creating beyond the bottom of that bodice, creating a little chain, and then sew the side seam on the skirt. And it's just kind of a quick way to speed up your sewing. It's probably doesn't save a whole ton of time, but it can in cases where you are finishing a lot of edges or doing like a lot of paneling or something like that.
It's definitely handy for making a quilt. When you're piecing a lot of pieces together, it can save a little bit of time on garments too.
Yeah, I like it for for serging. If I have to, say, if I'm making a pair of pants and I know I'm going to need to finish the side seams on all of the pieces, then I can do all of those at once on my serger. I think that can be really helpful. Our next tip is to find the part of sewing. This is more of like a practice or a way to think about your these little hacks per se, is find the part that's most tedious to you and then find the time-saving tool or the technique that's going to speed that up for you. So in my case, I'm not the biggest fan of cutting. So using a rotary cutter and using a screw punch, all of those are things that I incorporate into my sewing practice because they speed up that part of sewing that I don't necessarily want to spend oodles of time on. In my opinion, I think that like focusing too much on time saving can suck a little bit of the joy out of the practice of sewing. It becomes more about the finished product than the process itself. So really finding the tips that are best applied to your least favorite steps and, latching onto those.
Yeah. And I think there are certain things that can become just like kind of a part of your regular sewing practice. And it's less about, trying to get through it as quickly as possible, is just finding that little tip that makes something a little bit easier, maybe a little bit simpler, a little bit less. Don't have to pay quite as much attention, because there's so many things in sewing where you do have to pay a lot of attention. And it's nice to have those times that make it a little bit, take less focus, so that you can have that focus in reserve when you really need it.
Definitely.
I wanted to share a few more tips that we got from our community, also from our staff. So the first one I wanted to share, we had some variations on a theme, which is using adhesives to base things in place. So there are various adhesives that you can use to keep things in place while you're sewing. And a lot of these can make your sewing a lot easier and less fiddly. So this first one comes from Stephanie M. And I'm just going to quote her here. It's a little bit long, but Stephanie said, "A 1/4-inch quilter's tape is a pretty handy sewing doodad that I don't often hear garment makers mention. It sticks to fabric firmly, peels off without leaving a residue, and depending on the lint factor of your fabric, can be moved and restuck several times as needed. I first encountered quilter's tape in a Joanne zipper class, where we stuck it on as a top stitching guide. From there, I've used it for a lot of random tasks: marking/guiding buttonhole placement, lining up plaids, temporarily holding muslins in place when fitting on the body. Alas, I have yet to master the yoga move that will let me pin my own side seams. Its versatility makes it a great tool to keep on hand." That's a really great tip. And I love that quilter's tape has so many different uses. A 1/4 inch is pretty small, so you can fit it into a lot of different places. I think that's a really, really handy tip. And then a related one came from Taylor on the Seamwork staff, and she mentioned using Wonder Tape with some of the more detailed processes like collars, cuffs, and buttons. And Wonder's tape is a little bit different from quilter's tape, because Wonder Tape is double-sided, so you can use it in slightly different ways. So I think maybe having both of those types of tape on hand for different uses could be really, really helpful. Haley, you mentioned using Wonder Tape just to keep buttons on, like kind of temporarily keeping them in place before you sew. I want to try that, because that seems really, really helpful. I'm always worried about my buttons sliding around underneath the foot when I'm trying to sew them on.
Yeah, it is really helpful. The other thing I like about Wonder Tape, or that's just a brand name, I think that's the Dritz brand name, but Wonder Tape is a water-soluble tape, so it's great for things like centered zippers too, and using in places where once you're finished sewing, you're not going to be able to go back in and retrieve that tape. You don't have to worry about it, because it's going to wash out, the first time you put it through the wash. So that's a really great tool.
Yeah, that's true. And then a related one from Anna, and she says, "I use glue sticks to baste my hems beforehand or machine sewing. The glue sticks are non-toxic, acid-free, and wash out. This works especially well with narrow hems that are otherwise a little tricky. It also works well with bias bindings." So I think that's a really good tip. I've used glue sticks in the past for doing like a centered zipper, just holding the zipper temporarily in place without having to baste it. And it worked really, really well for that. And it does wash right out, and it doesn't hurt your garment. I might test it if I was putting it on something that would react to even water, like silk. You might not want to use it on something really delicate like that, or you might want to just test it out first. But overall, I found it to work really, really well. So those are all different types of adhesives that you could use to help you with your basting, which I love. I just love this idea. I think it saves time, but it makes it a little bit easier too, especially if it's things like a button that you might not be basting on otherwise. So the next one comes from Sigrid A, and she suggested making a hem template. So Sigrid said, "I have a piece of heavy paper, legal size, with lengthwise lines marked at 1/4, 1/2, and 5/8. It comes in handy when sewing instructions direct me to fold fabric over by one of these amounts and iron. I fold my fabric over the paper template and press evenly without having to mess around with the seam gauge. I developed this technique when I was teaching African refugees to sew. Well, I think that's a really, really great tip. And I think templates can be so helpful in a variety of situations. I think we kind of underuse them in sewing and home sewing, and I think they can be really, really helpful. And I love the idea of using like a really heavy paper because that just makes it even easier to press something over it. So that's a really, really great tip. It seems like it would just be so helpful. And unlike, for example, a ruler, which are usually plastic, I guess you could do something with a metal ruler, but they don't usually have the markings going lengthwise on them like a grid ruler does.
I have seen recently pop up heat-resistant rulers made with this specific purpose in mind. I think I saw one at Modern Domestic last time I was there. So that's a cool little tool. It's like looked like a gridded ruler, except you can iron right over it. So look out for those if you don't want to make one yourself.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. I'll have to look for one of those. Although a piece of paper is pretty cheap and easy, so.
Yeah, totally.
The next one also came from Sigrid, and she said to place pins with the head toward the edge. So she said, whenever you pin, put the heads at the outer edge of the fabric. This makes it much easier to pluck them out as you sew, and you can sew with either side up and still access the pins. I do not do this. We were talking about this because Haley does do this, and I do not do this. I always learned putting the pins the other way. I find it a little bit easier for putting the pins in and just like getting everything aligned, maybe just because there's more fabric on that side since that's the side you're pinning from. But I could see how pinning from the other side would be so helpful for the reasons that Sigrid mentioned. And I'm sure that's why you do it, Haley. So maybe I'll try it out on my next project.
Yeah, I really like the added bonus that I can retrieve the pins from either side. So you don't have to like think about, the orientation and how you're going to be sewing it. When you're pinning, just pin kind of willy-nilly.
Yeah, that would be a real bonus. I feel like I'm always like having to do that mental calculation about which side's going to be up.
Yeah, I'm all about those things that kind of like remove mental overhead when you're sewing.
Yeah, I think that's a theme here is just, where can you remove the extra step or the extra thought that it's going to take and make it a little bit easier on yourself. Just because, like I said, it's just, sewing is inevitably going to take a lot of concentration, and concentration is a finite resource. Focus is a finite resource. So if you can find ways to just make something a little bit more rote and a little bit easier, then frees up some of that concentration for the things that really need it. And you'll probably make fewer mistakes.
Definitely.
So those are our tips.
Yes, we shared a ton of tips today, so I'm not going to recap them because I think that would take me 10 minutes. But if you want to review some of these for yourself, you can check out a related article we have on our website at seamwork.com. We will also link it in the show notes so that you can reread all of these time-saving tips and really cement them into your mind, or quilters tape them into your mind, either or. And while you're on our website at seamwork.com, you can also take our sewing quiz. Our sewing quiz is totally free, and it helps you to learn what kind of sewist you are based on your unique sewing goals and personality, and kind of identifying what's most important to you in sewing right now, and gives you lots of suggestions on what to make or what to learn so you can achieve all of those goals. This quiz is super quick and easy and free. It only takes about 2 minutes to fill out, so you should definitely check it out. You can find it at seamwork.com/quiz. And if you liked this episode, we'd love it if you could leave us a rating or a review. We really appreciate all the love that you guys give us. And we also like it for practical reasons because it helps other people like us who love sewing, love talking and hearing about sewing, to find our little podcast. You can also follow us on YouTube at Seamwork Video, and on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to join Seamwork and become a part of our private community, plus get access to hundreds of sewing patterns and dozens of sew-along classes, podcast listeners get 50% off, and that's a lifetime discount. So for as long as you maintain that membership when you join, all you have to do is go to seamwork.com/go/podcast50.
All right. And that's it for us today. I'm Sarai.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio.
Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork, or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.